Hello everyone, it's Marc Sabatella from Mastering MuseScore and welcome to the Music Masterclass. So this is my regular Thursday series where we talk about making music and, using MuseScore along the way perhaps, but it's about the music making process here, composition, arranging, improvisation, theory, etc. So, hope that people are ready for some music talk here. And let me know, as always, how things are going. If everything's okay with sound and picture and all. So what I have here is I've got a few different people who have submitted some music lately, and I'm looking forward to checking some of it out. The first thing that I want to do is I want to follow up on a post from Frank Paul. About this, and actually, let me just check. Frank, are you here? No. I don't know if Frank's going to be with us today, but let me make sure I've got the chat visible. All right. So, hello. Okay. I just had to check my sound on my other speaker. Okay. He has done a harmonic analysis of the cello suite that we've been looking at in the Musicianship Skills Workshop. And I want to talk a little bit about his analysis. And also, actually, before I go any further, here's what I'm going to do. Give me 1 second here. I'm just going to cover my screen, except for the chat. And I'm going to try to play this from memory because, that's what one of the things, how this came up in talking was we wanted to talk about memory. And if you've been following my updates, you've seen how I'm doing with those first few measures. And I just want to give it one more shot before I actually look at the music. So. Okay. So I had to think. Could you see me thinking? Um, uh, but yeah, there were a couple spots where if you I mean I think I played it all right. Um, Other than the one spot here where we already know there was a typo in the original version that we were working from, that this guy right here is an E, and that's been fixed here, so that's great. So yeah, if you were following my updates in the music and musicianship skills workshop, you knew how I was sort of conceptualizing this to really cement my knowledge. But now let's actually talk about the harmonies going on, and I want to talk about the actual notation of the of things. So there's a couple things going on here that that Frank's doing that are really useful. And let me just take a quick look at participants, see if Frank happens to have popped up, because I did mention him. I was going to be looking at this. So there's a few things. So one of the things he's done is he's added some notations just by actually coloring note heads, so that he's coloring notes that are outside the chord, or however whatever's going on. He's notating certain things that way, which I think is quite useful if you're trying to do notation. Why not? I mean, if you're trying to do analysis. So he says non-chord tones marked with light blue note heads, right? And then also the actual chord symbols and Roman numeral analysis. So I'm going to make a couple observations about the general syntax here of how he's doing things, and then we'll go on and look at the actual analysis. So the Roman numeral analysis looks really, looks good to me. It's basically the way I would want to see things done. The chord symbols, there's a couple of things that are a little odd here that I want to talk about. One is a triad. Usually we just write the root. So we would just write G, not G-M-A-J, to indicate a triad. The only time we so this is like a weird thing about chord symbols. It makes no logical sense whatsoever, but it's the truth. The abbreviation minor in a chord symbol means what you think it means. It means the chord is minor. It means basically it's a minor third. So a G minor, this is G major, that's G minor. So if you see minor in a chord symbol, it's telling you about that B flat, right? It's telling you about the third. If you see major in a chord symbol, it doesn't mean it's a major chord. It means it's a major seventh. The only time you ever put the word major in a chord symbol is to talk about the seventh. We don't write the word major or any abbreviation for major just to talk about triads. It just isn't done. It just isn't done. So if someone sees G maj like that, they might think it means that you really meant G major 7 and just left out the seventh. So we just write G for that. Maj always refers to the seventh. So even if someone writes G major 9, what it really means is G9 with a major seventh. Maj always refers to the seventh. That's just the way it is. Okay, so this chord I would really notate just as G. And then the next thing I would observe about the next chord, since I'm talking about sevenths, this chord, yes, it is a C major 7, C, E, G, and a B. But, you analyze this A as a non-chord tone. It's a lower neighbor. Really, Bach isn't really thinking about this B as a seventh. I would pretty much guarantee he's not thinking seventh. It's just a neighbor tone. It happens to be the seventh, but for analysis purpose, I think we'll just call that a triad. I mean, unless he's really functionally dealing with it as a seventh and then resolving it down a step in the next measure and doing all the things that one would do with sevenths, but that is just not the case. Let's just call that a neighbor tone. And then finally, this business here, notating that the same chord gets repeated, just not necessary. That all just like with the Roman numerals, just leave that out, and we know the chord symbol just continues. Because as it is, I look at that and I'm like, well, what is that? Oh, it's just telling me what I already knew. So it causes this extra little moment of confusion that gets in the way of actually playing from the chord symbols, which is usually the goal of the chord symbols, is to allow people to play from them. All right, so that's some nomenclature stuff. Now let's talk about the actual analysis. So yeah, the seventh is there. So we've got the 1 chord, yep, and then we've got the 4 chord. And now he's got this next chord notated as G major 7th. And now, so here's the thing where this gets subjective. Trying to understand how to notate, if you see a combination, like these notes, right? Those notes are not a thing. The G, an F sharp, a B, and a C. They don't add up to any particular chord. So one of those is a non-chord tone. And Frank has chosen to call the C the non-chord tone and saying that this is the basic chord, a G major 7th. And as a jazz person, I'm used to major 7ths. I'm fine with major 7th chords. But okay, so first of all, Bach, we won't want to assume major 7ths. I mean, if there's no other way to look at it, and you need to call it a major 7th, they exist. Bach definitely. I mean, right, that little thing in that prelude there, that's a major 7th chord. No getting around it. However, I would be suspect about this, even if I weren't already familiar with the piece, as being a G major 7th chord for a couple reasons. One is it seems a little weird for that major 7th chord to be there, and then the 7th to just disappear in the next measure, and now it's just a plain triad. And it also, actually, he doesn't say G major 7, in which case that F sharp is also a non-chord tone, right? But it just seems a little weird for the chord progression to have gone 1, 4, and then come back to 1, and then just stay 1 for 2 measures. This doesn't feel natural. I'm going to put on my hat that says I know what chord progressions usually look like, and try to look at this in a way that I think makes sense harmonically. If I see 1, and then a measure later I see 4, and then I see a mystery chord, and then the next measure I see 1 again. You'd have a real hard time convincing me that that mystery chord wasn't 5. If there's anything about it that looks at all like 5, I'm going to call it 5. Okay? I see 1, 4, X, 1. X equals 5. this is my assumption, and I'll solve for X. I'll actually look at the notes and see, can I look at this as a 5 chord in any way? And if so, that's what I'm going to do. So let's talk about this. We got a G chord here. So the 5 chord would be D, right? And in particular, D7. So, well, we have F sharp. That's good. And we got a C. Hey, that's the 7th. What I don't have is a D, and what I don't have is an A. And I do have this pesky G and this pesky B. I'm not going to worry about that. Here's what I say. G is a pedal tone. So this is like organ pedal. Arpeggiating the chords. Pedal tone, right? We're just holding that G while playing the chords on top. So that's what pedal point is, and that's what's going on here. This is just a G pedal point. So I don't have to think of that G as a chord tone. It's pedal point. So that allows me to not have to worry about that G being, well, the G's not in a D chord. What about the B? Well, the B is that same lower neighbor that we've had all along, right? We had ba-do-dum, and then ba-do-dum, and then ba-do-dum, right? So that lower neighbor figure is pretty well established, so I'm very comfortable calling that B a lower neighbor. I'm very comfortable calling that G pedal point, and Colleen, you're absolutely right. That 3rd and the 7th, for me, and for you as a jazz musician, I'm perfectly fine with just hearing the 3rd and 7th and say, hey, that's D7. Now, this is me talking about jazz, right? If I want to put on my more Baroque hat here, I'll say, okay, the D's not there. So in jazz terms, oh, that's a rootless voicing, right? And the bass player's job is to play that D, and he chose to do pedal point instead. That's his problem or her problem. But if we're analyzing Bach, let's maybe get a little more inside this. Instead of calling this D7, I'm going to call it F sharp diminished. Right? That's what I'm going to call it. So let me come back to the beginning here and make some of these edits. That's just G. This I'm just going to call C. And Roman numeralize, it's 4. And here's the other thing. I can call it 4/6/4, a 4 chord in second inversion. I could just say it's a 4 chord with pedal point. You know, I could totally just do that also. But for this guy, what I'm going to do is call it F sharp diminished with a G in the bass. And the thing is, there is no great Roman numeral analysis way of indicating pedal point. I mean, there's lots of different ways that people come up with, but I think I'm just going to do this. I'm just going to call it 7. And I'm going to call this guy just 4. Yeah, that's that chord. And then it resolves here. And that's a thing. I mean, that is totally a thing. You know where I first learned that trick? Here's where I first learned that trick. Right, so diminished, resolving to 1. I also learned it this way, to play an actual D triad, major triad. Anyhow, so it's a fairly standard trick to have the 7 chord with the 1 pedal underneath it, resolving to 1. Pretty standard little trick. So anyhow, that's what I'm going to call that thing. So what I'm getting at here is an important point that I want to really emphasize here, because it's a big point to make. the best way to analyze chords is usually not to look at the notes and then try to name them. Instead, it's to look at the context and then see if you can make those notes fit your impression of what you already think that chord is. So that's a really important point because okay, so here's the thing. I hang out on some of the music theory, like Reddit, Facebook groups, etc., and invariably every single day. Like I could probably go to the music theory Facebook group or subreddit right now and see a question asked within the last 6 hours that consists of someone saying, "Hey, I just came up with this cool chord. What's it called? It's got a G, a B, a D, and an F sharp." And the answer is, I don't know what it's called. We need to know the context. That's always the answer. We can't put a name on the thing. I mean, even if I play this, you might say, oh, that's a C major chord. Yeah, but in context, if I'm playing that's an F major chord that just happens to have a major seventh and has a G in the melody that's resolving up to the third, right? I mean, I just made that up. That's not a song, although it's probably a million songs. So you can't just take a collection of pitches and name it and expect that name to be meaningful. It often isn't. It's always about context. So that's just a really important point to make. Now, that said, there's some really good stuff here. Like he's got this A7 going to D, and this is absolutely true, and he's analyzing that absolutely correctly in the key of D. That is 5. I don't know what that 1 is there, but this is 5 in the key of D going to 1. And realistically, then the question is, have we really modulated to D, or was this just a secondary dominant? In other words, do we just call it 5 of 5 going to 5? Well, the answer is, how long does it stay in that key? And the answer, I totally agree with Frank here, because at first I didn't. I said, oh, no, you shouldn't have notated a modulation. It doesn't really modulate. It's just 5 of 5 going to 5, and then it starts doing normal stuff. But no, it doesn't, actually, because after that 1 chord here, D, we now get a 2, another secondary dominant, and back to 1. Yeah, I think the secondary dominant is not really true here. This is not an E7. That C sharp, I think, is more significant. But those C sharps themselves are telling me we're in the key of D. Basically, we haven't had from this point right here, where that C sharp shows up in measure 5, up until here in measure 12, there's no C naturals. All the C's, we have this C sharp, we have that C sharp, we have that C sharp, and we got this C sharp. All these C's are C sharps. So, yeah, we're in the key of D at this point. So this is absolutely proper to notate that as having modulated to D. So, and again, the same kind of issue of, I'm not going to worry about calling that C sharp a major 7th. Let's just call it D. Okay, so this is definitely an E minor chord. Now, this next chord. So this whole business here, I look at this and already there's a few bells going off in my head. Let me tell you about the bells that are ringing for me. The bells that are ringing for me. Something like that, right? Almost like being in love. That's the song. Okay. There's a couple things that are ringing for me here. If we're in the key of D, I'm really quite surprised to see a D chord, that 1 chord, showing up on beat 4 of a measure. That feels suspect. Also, I see E7 in the key of D, and that's fine. That would be 5 of 5. He's calling it 2 of 5. That would really be 5 of 5. It's either 2 or it's 5 of 5, right? But, okay, so here's the thing. Actually, he's kind of maybe confused. I think he's maybe copy and paste error in this. Frank, are you here? Yeah. No. Okay. This is in the key of D. That I want this to be a 5 chord, and I see a C sharp in the key of D. A7 is our 5 chord. It's got that C sharp in it. I want to see a 5 chord here. My brain is expecting a 5 chord. I've just had a 2 chord, and now I have X, and then I have 1. 2x1. X is 5. This is going to be a rule of algebra here. Earlier we had 4x1, and I told you X was going to be 5 probably. Here we've got 2x1. And I'm telling you, X is probably 5. If there's any way for me to look at this as a 5 chord, I will. So, there's my root of my 5 chord. In the key of D, A is my 5 chord, there's my root. I got my 3rd here, I got my 5th, and then my 7th there, and then my 3rd again, root, and the 7th again. That whole measure is A7. There's not 3 different chords there. There's definitely not an E7 because there's no G sharp. At most, it would be more E minor 7. But again, why would we expect 2 measures of 2 and then changing to 1? And why changing to 1 in the middle of the measure? Instead, what's happening here is 2, 2, 5. What's happening? 2, 5, 1. Sorry, my voice is all over the place, but y'all know I'm not a singer. So 5, 1. So even though the A is not very prominent here, we only hear it at like the end of that beat there, in the middle of that beat there. It's not very prominent, but it is there. If it wasn't there at all, I would do the same thing. I'd say, okay, it's 5, but it's 7. I would call it C sharp diminished. But so if the A wasn't there at all, I would call it C sharp diminished. Just like a couple measures earlier, I called this F sharp diminished instead of D, right? D7, if we leave out the D, is F sharp diminished. A7, if we leave out the A, is C sharp diminished. Bach uses that equivalence all the time. And then sometimes he bothers to give you the A and sometimes he doesn't. Again, to me as a jazz guy, I'm just going to call it 5. I'm going to call that A7 no matter what, whether the A is there or not. But here the A is there. There's definitely no reason not to just call it A7. So this is a whole measure of A7, then resolving to D. So this is just more example of that idea. Know what? Don't look at the notes first and then try to name them. Because if you look at the notes first, you see an E and you see, hey, look, it's kind of based on E. There's a 7th there, the D. So it kind of feels like it's based on E. But if you put it in context and really look at the big picture there, you've got to start seeing 5s. You got to see more 5s. So, then he's got this nice G sharp diminished going to A minor, which is absolutely what he says it is. It's G sharp minor, G sharp diminished going to A minor is sharp 2, right? Because now he's thinking back in our original key, because at this point we're moving back to our original key of G. And so sharp 2 going to sharp 1. That should be actually sharp 1. That's a typo. So G sharp would be sharp 1 going to 2, or do like you did here, call it 7 of 2 going to 2. So that's what I would really call this. 7 of 2 going to 2. 7 of 2 going to 2. And now, here again, even without analyzing further, I see a diminished chord, B sharp diminished. No, I think you meant, oh well. Okay, so it's a little curious that you're calling this B sharp diminished when there is no actual B sharp in there. I want to call it D sharp diminished. And I'll tell you why I want to call it D sharp diminished. Because why do I want to call it D sharp diminished? Because I suspect that this G chord here I would rather call E minor. And yeah, I think I do. Yeah, so I think that this E is more significant. I don't think it's just a non-chord tone. I'd have to think about it more, but when I hear this D sharp diminished chord going here, That's 7 to 1 in E minor. So this is actually the E minor is the 6th chord, and this guy I will just call D sharp diminished, and that makes it 7 of 6. So again, I'm all about making sure, because if you can't put a name to what these things are, why they are there, then there's a good chance you haven't named it right. And Graham, I just saw your comment there, and yeah, context is absolutely, yeah, wood for the trees, forest for the trees is what we say in the United States, but wood meaning forest, yeah, absolutely. So the other observation. So yeah, that's we're just going to see more of the same kinds of things going on here. By the way, one other comment about this. Oh, this really is a G7 here. Yeah, it's got that G, B, and F. So great. And so this here, G, I'm expecting that to be 5 of 4 going to 4. So instead of calling it 1/7, let's call it 5/7 of 4. As a jazz person, I'm fine with 1/7, but if we're analyzing Bach, let's use Bachian types of. Actually, I don't know that Bach would have used Roman numerals, but you know that's what we do when analyzing Bach. We use 5 of 4 instead of calling it 1/7. The other comment that I was going to make is like here it is. Here again, this F sharp, I could just call it a passing tone. I don't need to incorporate it in the chord. But if I did and wanted to call this G major 7, I can't call the chord symbol 1/7. That's too ambiguous. I mean, it has a Roman numeral. There might be some theory text written before jazz was a thing that might do that and say, oh, if you see 1/7, it means major 7. But that's going to be too confusing to anyone who's ever heard of jazz or ever heard of chord symbols at all. All right, see you later, Colleen. So instead, we'd actually put the Maj 7 into the Roman numeral. Pretty much most textbooks written in the last 100 years do some variation of that because they realize that if you just write 1/7, people aren't going to assume that means major 7 anymore. It's just not. It's too out of touch with how chord symbols work. But older textbooks would have done that. So. And then we got more pedal point here, and yeah, just a lot more of the same things. So here's going to be my last kind of overall comment about this, because we've kind of gone through the first page of this, and then we're going to just see some more of the same kinds of things. My claim to you, and I think this is a pretty good claim, is if you're analyzing a Bach piece and you see something that you can't analyze as a secondary dominant, it's either if you see a non-diatonic chord. If it's a diatonic chord, great, it's a diatonic chord, and just call it what it is. If you see a non-diatonic chord that you can't analyze as a secondary dominant, try this. Try squinting. Try looking at it sideways, look at it upside. Do what it takes to try to see that sucker as a secondary dominant or a secondary diminished chord, right? So instead of 5 of, instead of like we had instead of this being E7 going to A minor, because they're really. Yeah, even though there's an E in it, I'm still not going to call it E7 because it's fulfilling that neighbor tone kind of position. This is really a G sharp diminished 7th chord. So this is still a secondary dominant as far as I'm concerned. It's tonicizing the A minor, whether it's literally E7 or it's evil twin G sharp diminished. Evil twin, that's kind of a good word because diminished chords are kind of have that that evil aspect to them, right? So whether you call this E7 or whether you call it G sharp diminished 7, it's tonicizing that A minor. If you see a non-diatonic chord that isn't one of those, there's a good chance you're looking at it wrong, because that's a whole lot of what Bach writes: diatonic chords and secondary dominants or diminished chords. I'm not saying every single chord he ever writes is one of those, but man, you if you see something that you can't analyze in one of those ways, it's a pretty good chance you got it wrong. Pretty good chance you're missing something. You're missing the wood. Anyhow, that's my observation. There's examples here and there, and I think been mentioning, my wife Kari's been like practicing the piano a lot lately, and I've been hearing like all sorts of different music, and she was playing another Bach prelude the other day that very clearly had an augmented sixth chord in it. And I'm like, wow, you don't find a whole lot of augmented sixth chords, tritone substitutions in jazz language. You don't see a whole lot of those in Bach. But there was one, and I was like all excited and came running down to check it out, and I've already forgotten where it was. A G minor. It was that weird G minor lute prelude that was transcribed for piano and then sort of ends up in a different key entirely. Or C minor, and it ends up in G minor. I don't know. All right, so that's the thing. And so my point here is to look at what Frank has done, which is like labeling things really nicely, and I like the way he's doing this, but let's, in doing this sort of analysis, take a deeper step back, because then you have a more understanding of why these chords are there. If this had been an E7, I wouldn't have been able to understand why it was there. Why would there be an E7 going to E minor and then D? It doesn't make sense necessarily. But if I see E minor to A7 to D, I'm like, oh, 2, 5, 1 in D. Got it. That's one chunk of information, not 3 random chords that you're trying to understand how they got there. Okay, so I'm just going to now just load up a couple other scores that were submitted recently and just take a quick listen to them, because there's interesting stuff in them. And so I'm not going to go into a lot of depth on these, in part because we've already commented on some of this. I've commented in the community, and also some of these pieces, like, well, the Queen one, I'm going to go back and hear online. But Dave, are you here? No Dave here. All right. I'm just going to play some of these pieces because they're fun to play, and let's hear Dave's piece. So this is a piece that he wrote, talking about the fact that he was hearing this music he didn't like at the pool and wanted to write some music to counter it. And if I'm understanding his intent correctly, let's actually pop over to the community and see if I can, get a little better read. The way I interpreted his comments is he wanted to write some music that incorporated elements of the music that was annoying him to fight back with. I don't know if that was an accurate statement or not. There were some comments on the piece, but they're being real slow loading, so maybe they were on might have been actually on MuseScore.com where the comments were. Yeah, let's just hear the music. Okay, I'm pausing this for a second only because the playback isn't following it as well as it otherwise might. So I'm going to switch to continuous view and hope that it follows a little better. So we just heard that repeated section, so I'm just going to move on to the next repeated section. All right, Dave. I like this piece a lot. And the thing is with Stockhausen, Graham, because yeah, I mean I agree. I'm not like really familiar with Stockhausen's music. I've heard little bits of it here and there. Um, but what I can say about this is it's coming from a similar place of using, sort of classical type approaches to, but also types of approaches that are associated most often with electronic music and ambient music in particular. And so there's a number of things going on that produce that. One is the steady drum beat, right? So the steady drum beat is the underpinning that then allows these whole notes, because like there's passages where there's really nothing going on but whole notes and half notes, but the drum beat is kind of continuing. Obviously, you can see the measure repeat symbols there telling us that. Um, so this idea of sustained chords over a drum beat, yeah, that is kind of, it's not a genre in itself, but it's an element of a couple specific genres like ambient or ambient music, um, and electronica. There's all sorts of different names you put on it depending on where you're coming from, what your spin on the idea is. But there's the idea of whole notes or long sustained chords on top of a pulse of some kind, and the pulse might be less prominent in true ambient music. I don't know. It depends on who you're listening to. But one of the things, so the term that we would use for these sustained chords is what they're called pads. And it really is a technique that you could write that way for strings, and people did write that way for strings sometimes, but it really becomes a common way of approaching music when synthesizers enter in the picture. Because I think I'm just gonna speak kind of off the cuff here. I think most arrangers would not want to just write whole notes for strings because they had a sense that the string players would get bored and they could do other things that were more interesting, more challenging, whatever. And the composers would be like, well, I want to write more stuff. And they want to do more stuff. But sometimes a whole note is exactly what the doctor ordered, right? If you're trying to get this kind of ambient sound. And so synthesizers made that possible. They made it okay to just hold a chord. And in my case here, I would hold it with a string sound. And you can hold this sucker all day long, right? As long as I hold that chord, it's going to keep playing. And real piano doesn't do that. Real string players will struggle sustaining. I mean, you can do this thing where you slowly bow up and down, but you're not going to get it as smooth as this, right? So the idea of a pad, and then synthesizers would have specific sounds. Before the days when synthesizers mostly had samples of real acoustic instruments, synthesizers were mostly about sounds that could be created electronically by combining sine waves or whatever else they would do, or oscillators and so forth. Pad sounds that had a sustain like that were very natural. If you're creating sound through raw synthesis and not through sampling a real instrument and then trying to mimic its qualities, sounds are going to sustain naturally. So most synthesizer sounds, or a lot of synthesizer sounds, naturally work well as pads. And so you have all these different sounds that are available, and MuseScore has some built into its general MIDI sound stuff. So anyhow, this idea of pads with slow moving things like that, slow moving melody, and then little bits of motion, right? And this is really cool. And then just back to the pad, right? These little motions that show up in the middle of that ambient sound is that's like part of the style too, and it's a nice effect, and it's nice that it's kind of dissonant, kind of like polytonal, like that. The line when the clarinet comes in feels like it's in a totally different key. That's a triad. That's pretty dissonant there. And now that feels like there's two different chords. In fact, if I put this thing in concert pitch, whoa. Oh, that's because there's so dang many flats. So, yeah, it's basically a B chord, and then is that really all that is? Because the chord has changed now at this point. It's well, it's this is the horn. It's the horn having the E that I was thinking it was the clarinet line that was giving it the polytonal feel. No, it's the E in the horns. Because if I removed the E from the horn, now this is going to sound a lot more diatonic. So the fact that it goes up to F, that's a sharp 4, right? That makes it sound Lydian, but it's not as dissonant as the E was. Now hearing both of those gives us more of that kind of polytonal, different chords laid on top of each other. So in any case, yeah, I think this is, I know it was written, well, at least I believe it was written somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but I mean, it's really effective in a lot of ways. And in particular, there's nice things going on. So first of all, if we accept that this is sounds being created by a computer, or sounds that could be played on a synthesizer, this all works well. But I will say, real horns aren't going to be able to just play whole notes all day long like that. They're gonna pass out. Yes, they'll have to take a breath somewhere, and that's gonna interfere with the flow of the sound. It won't sound as smooth, so they'll have to stagger their breathing some. But even so, that's just a lot of sustained blowing for the horns. And yeah, you get lightheaded after a while if you ask especially brass players to play long notes for that long. So you might figure out a way to rescore it if you ever want this played by real musicians. But as something to be played by synthesizers, yeah, use a horn sound. That's fine. But what's really cool is voice leading wise is really nice, right? It's just moving things. And even when there's dissonance, like pretty extreme dissonance, it's well treated. I'm playing the horn parts. And now this chord here is quite interesting. Right? I mean, these are really nice voice leading. The top line, the two horn parts are moving by step mostly, and they're forming interesting sounds that are kind of like polychord kind of sounds, a triad, or two notes a third apart, but then some note that underneath it that doesn't really fit the chord that it's otherwise might be suggesting. And there's certain chords that are just like so dark. They're I where was the one? There was like yeah, it's not in there. It's the end of this part here. I don't know. Oh, it's right here. Okay. It's just really dark sounding. Now here, these two. Right? So we've gone from that chord here, which is basically just a B chord or a C flat chord, right? Then essentially we're getting an F minor chord. We're going from a B major chord to an F minor chord. That's dark. I mean, if you think about this circle of fifths wise, it's just it's one of these modulations. I mean, it's not a modulation; it's just a random chord, right? But it has that darkifying effect. It's going from a key of 5 sharps to a key of 4 flats. It's very far apart on the circle of fifths, and so it has that shocking effect that I've often compared to like film score music and stuff. So he's got a lot of that language going on here. So in any case, Dave, not sure exactly what you were aiming for here. But yeah, I feel like as a piece of electronic ambient music, you're onto something here. So, Humble Music, you are here, I see. I'm going to go ahead and listen. If I can get MuseScore's playback to, if I can get MuseScore.com to cooperate and my web connection to cooperate enough, I want your Queen piece played. Here we go. Because it's going to sound better than MuseScore playing it, right? You can start now. Yeah, gorgeous tribute there. So we talked a little about this at one point, I think, during office hours, just about how you generated the melody using just a key. A is A, B is B, C is C, D, E, F, G, and then the letter H becomes A, the letter I becomes B. In other words, you go through the alphabet and assign each letter of the alphabet to a note. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, etc. And that's where you get that melody from. Um, and I know you've used that type of key on a number of places. And then I see when you modulate it to E here, you're keeping the same melody. It's no longer that same key. It's just that melody modulated to E, which I don't know if you did that specifically because we were talking about modulations in thirds last week, or if you had already written that, or if that's just coincidence. But yeah, so the modulating in third gives it this like richer sound, and it's higher. So you went a third higher. Repeating, so when I talk about modulations changing a sound, usually the type of modulations we deal with in classical music do not mean repeating the same melody in a new key. It means a new melody in the new key. So we don't get to talk about whether it's higher or lower. That's not actually relevant. But if you do repeat the same melody in the new key, well, now we're hearing that same melody, and now we can talk about whether it's how would I put it? Because now I lost my train of thought because I saw your comment about E for Elizabeth. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, we talk about whether it's higher or lower. When we hear the same melody going up higher, it adds a little layer of excitement to the piece because most instruments, and certainly human voice, gets added intensity as we bring it up a little higher. Piano maybe a little less so. It doesn't have extra intensity as it gets higher, the same way other instruments do. But the fact that it's a distant key relationship, C to E, gives it some of that same effect. So yeah, really nice playing of that melody. For my purposes, I'd love to see chord symbols in here so that we know what you were playing based on. And by the way, I'm assuming that as per usual, you won't, you're working and wouldn't be able to join us in conversation here. But if you ever, so I'm not going to bother with the whole technical rigmarole to bring you on board unless you tell me you want to. Anytime you tell me, happy to have you. But I'll say that having chord symbols would be really nice so that, other people could play it and so we could talk more about what's happening. But I remember. I'm going to play it faster and then this was a 4-chord but pedal. So this is the thing. I don't know that you did this on purpose. You probably didn't. But this starts off the same way that cello suite does, in the sense it's a 1-chord and then 4-chord, but keeping the pedal of C. And then you do just go back to 1. I said Bach wouldn't do that, but, you're not Bach, you're writing your own type of music here. If it was Bach, it would have gone, and then it would have had a 5-chord in there probably also. Not that Bach would never go 4 to 1, but it would be a more rare thing. So I heard that pedal point of the C and then going to the 4 and coming back, and there's really a whole lot of the 4 and the 1 and not a lot of the 5 happening here, which kind of gives it a lack of tension. We talk about music being a series of tension and release, and tension is good in music. We use it, we create it, and then we release it. But sometimes we just want not tension. We want release. And so it really relates this to Dave's piece. And when I'm saying you're not, of course, I'm not using that as a qualitative judgment. I'm just saying, you write differently. You write a lot like Bach when you want to, but this is clearly, you're going for something totally different here, right? So anyhow, that 1-4 without really as clear of a sense of a 5 as much, gives this piece more of that same mood that Dave's piece had, frankly, of this sort of atmospheric thing going on. Now, right around here, I don't know if it's going to take forever to... let me start the measure before that. It's here where you bring in the secondary dominant. Right? So you're going, and then major seventh, and then dominant seventh, and then going to the four. So you go into the four, but using an actually secondary dominant to pull you there. So that relates to what I was saying about Bach using secondary dominants. It's just huge. And then you kind of live in the key of F for a little while, which we can tell by those B flats. Now, the one thing that I would say about this piece, other than just that, yeah, I would want to see chord symbols so that we understand what you're doing, but this as a kind of a recurring thing. So what I'm about to say, you've heard before, and I will say it again. I'm not at all convinced that your beat one is your beat one. I think there's places where your downbeats are in the middle of the measure. So I think you'd be better off notating this with note values that are twice as long. Then you wouldn't need the tempo to be 40. You could call it 80, but this is a dotted half note. Or put it in 2/4, because yeah, there's all sorts of places where a note that feels like the downbeat is not occurring on the downbeat. And one of the really prominent examples of that is right here in bar 17. Let me play the little section leading up to that. That's the downbeat. Even though you don't get to the E until a little bit later, motion-wise, that F sharp was the downbeat. You just happened to land on an odd chord tone. And that's just one example that I thought was especially prominent. But there's lots of places in here where I have a similar overall feel about the piece that that there's places in the middle of the measure, that's where your cadences are, that should be at the beginning of the measure. And that's one of the things I also commented about Frank's analysis on the Bach piece here, that I knew something was amiss when he was trying to tell me there was a one chord happening on beat 4. I'm like, that doesn't feel right. And in this case, it wasn't right. The one chord happens on beat 1. He just had it labeled a little early. In your case, I think it's that, you're playing it where you want to play it, but I think you need to notate it a little differently. And going along with that, there's all sorts of notational things then. Like, you can't do this. You can't have eighth, dotted half, and then eighth, because dotted half notes can only start on a beat, either beat 1 or beat 2. And otherwise, you need to split them up with a tie, right? So this would have to be a dotted quarter tied to a dotted quarter so that we can see beat 3. And that type of thing happens pretty often. Here's another example of it right before the key change. Dotted quarter, this C half note has to be notated as an eighth note tied to a dotted quarter so that we can see beat 3. The only times you can get away with not showing beat 3 is when you have a really simple rhythm that doesn't involve eighth notes. A half note on beat 2 is allowed to straddle. A dotted half note on beat 1 or 2 is allowed to straddle that middle of the measure. But anything more complicated than that, you need to break it up that way. So breaking it up that way would clarify it from a reading perspective, but also just having more measures. Not more notes, more measures. More notes, actually, because you're breaking up long notes into dotted notes. Anyhow, that's my observation. That's it's kind of a common thing in a number of your pieces, especially some of these slower ones like this, where there is a pulse. There is a sense of where one is, but it might not all be 4/4 measures. You might have measures that have fewer beats in them, or it just might be that there's the midpoints of the measures are actually the downbeats. I don't know, but generally speaking, that's something you want to be looking at a little bit more. All right, before I go, I am going to just point out one thing that also this reminds me of, since we're on this whole topic of this kind of slow-moving ambient music. I'm relatively certain I'm not going to be able to find an example. I'm not going to be able to find this thing online, because why would I? But it's a recording that I played on called Gallery. Is just a duet of me and trumpet player Hugh Reagan, and I don't know if it's on Spotify. If it was on Spotify, I could just listen to the dang thing. Otherwise, I'll have to go through a whole lot of stuff. But what I want to say about this piece is it is very reminiscent of yeah, gallery is not there, of what you're doing, and I think it's an A flat. And I'm again playing this faster. It's incredibly slow. It goes on for like 20 minutes. This is the melody, and it's this simple. And this is like, you know, a major, like, avant-garde jazz trumpet player we're talking about. But he just wanted to write this really simple piece. And that's the A section, and then it repeats again, and it's a lot slower, so it's several minutes into the piece before we ever get to the bridge. Is like the most welcome 4-chord I've ever played. Because it's like you sit on that one chord, that A flat, just pedaling like that. I just pedal on that A flat chord for the entire two A sections that last like a couple minutes, and then I finally get to play a 4-chord for the bridge, and then it's back to the A flat, and then it's like 10 minutes of improvisation, or more than that, like 15 minutes of improvisation, all based on A flat. We go other places, but we stay on an A flat. And I don't get to play a D flat again until, like, you know, 18 minutes into the song. That's the spot where I go, and that's like just... that was like the biggest release of tension in my entire life in music, was that 4-chord 18 minutes into the dang piece, getting to play this big, and it was like where I was playing this huge Bösendorfer piano. It was beautiful. Was it Bösendorfer? I think it was. Anyhow, it was that was like this sort of religious experience of just playing that 4-chord after having it withheld from me for 18 minutes. So yeah, that's part of this whole tension and release dynamic. That's kind of interesting. All right. Anyhow, just wanted to share that because the music we were playing today kind of reminded me of that little story. So that said, let's close things out, and we'll be back with more music next week. Be back with more MuseScore Cafe next week. I will continue to remind you, MuseScore 4 is coming, and there will be new stuff happening with that, and a new MuseScore 4 course, and I might be rearranging some stuff about how some other things are happening to allow more possibilities, and just keep bearing with me as we try some new things. One thing I mentioned before is I want to do a non-visual music masterclass sometime soon, where we just use our ears. See how that goes. Anyhow, I'll see you next time, and sometime soon, expect to not see me, but to only hear me. All right, talk to you next time. Bye.